a body washed ashore on the coast of southern Spain. The man appeared to be a British military officer. He wore the uniform of the Royal Marines and carried identification naming him as Major William Martin. In his pockets were the kinds of things one might expect to find on any traveling officer. Letters, receipts, bank correspondence, a photograph of a young woman. Nothing about them seemed unusual on their own, but together they painted a picture of a real person with a life beyond the uniform. Attached to his wrist was a leather briefcase. Inside were several military documents. As Spanish authorities examined the material, it became clear that the papers were not routine correspondence. They appeared to contain information relating to future Allied operations. The discovery soon attracted attention beyond the local officials handling the case. Spain was officially neutral, but both Allied and German intelligence services operated extensively within the country, and documents of this nature were unlikely to remain unnoticed for long. Over the following days, copies of the material began making their way through intelligence channels. German agents became interested in the contents, and before long the documents were being examined far beyond the Spanish coast where they had first been found. But the story was not quite as straightforward as it appeared. Nearly 4 years of war had transformed the continent. From the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, entire regions had been drawn into the conflict. Paris remained under German occupation. Warsaw was under Nazi control. Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and much of Eastern Europe were firmly within Germany's sphere of influence. Across the continent, railways carried troops and supplies between occupied territories. Military headquarters coordinated operations stretching across thousands of kilometers. But beneath the appearance of control, cracks were beginning to emerge. Just weeks earlier, the Battle of Stalingrad had come to an end. After months of fighting, Germany's Sixth Army had been destroyed, marking one of the most significant defeats suffered by the Wehrmacht during the war. Far to the south, Axis forces in North Africa were being pushed back toward Tunisia. The Mediterranean had become increasingly contested. British bombers struck industrial targets across occupied Europe. German aircraft continued raids and defensive operations across multiple fronts. Every major power on the continent was preparing for the next phase of the war. In Berlin, military planners expected that phase to begin somewhere in southern Europe. The question was where. The Balkans remained vulnerable. Greece was a possibility. Sardinia was another concern. Reports, intelligence assessments, and intercepted communications flowed continuously through German headquarters as officials attempted to determine where the Allies would strike next. By the spring of 1943, a single mistake in that calculation could alter the course of the war. The reports continued moving through German intelligence channels. By mid-May, the information had reached the highest levels of command. On the 14th of May, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz met Adolf Hitler to discuss the state of the war. Among the subjects raised was a recently recovered set of British documents obtained in Spain. To Hitler, the documents appeared to confirm an existing concern. The next Allied invasion, he believed, would not be directed primarily at Sicily. Instead, attention increasingly shifted toward the eastern Mediterranean. Toward Greece. Toward Sardinia. During the meeting, Hitler dismissed the idea that Sicily was the most likely target and argued that the captured documents reinforced the belief that Allied forces intended to strike elsewhere. The consequences were immediate. Orders began moving across Europe. An experienced German armored formation, the 1st Panzer Division, was ordered out of France and transferred toward Greece. Additional troops were directed into the Balkans. By the end of June, German troop strength on Sardinia had roughly doubled. Fighter aircraft were redeployed to the island. German torpedo boats were moved from Sicily toward the Greek islands. More divisions arrived in Greece, while further reinforcements were sent into the Balkans. Across southern Europe, commanders prepared for an attack they believed was coming. Resources were shifted. And all of it was based, at least in part, on information recovered from the body of a dead officer found on a Spanish beach. July 10, 1943. In the early hours of the morning, Allied forces landed on the shores of Sicily. Thousands of British, American and Canadian troops came ashore as hundreds of ships gathered off the island's coastline. After months of planning, the invasion had finally begun. But there was one problem. This wasn't where Germany had been expecting it. In the weeks leading up to the attack, German commanders had spent valuable time preparing for possible operations in Greece and the Balkans. Troops had been transferred. Aircraft had been relocated. Naval units had been moved across the Mediterranean. Now, reports arriving from Sicily were painting a very different picture. The main Allied effort was not heading toward Greece. It was already underway in Sicily. As the scale of the landings became clear, German forces rushed to respond. Reinforcements were sent in. Counterattacks were launched. But the Allies had secured their foothold. Town by town, the fighting moved across the island. By August, Sicily was lost. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Axis powers. Only weeks later, Mussolini was removed from power, and Italy's position in the war began to unravel. Looking back, the invasion of Sicily would become one of the most important campaigns of the Mediterranean War. And yet, months before the first Allied soldier stepped onto those beaches, another event had quietly set everything in motion. Not on a battlefield, not aboard a warship, but on a lonely stretch of Spanish coastline, a dead British officer, a briefcase, and a set of documents that Germany had accepted as genuine. At least, that's what they believed, because the truth was far stranger. The officer wasn't carrying secret plans. He was the plan. And to understand how it happened, we have to go back several months, to Britain, where a handful of intelligence officers were trying to solve a problem that seemed almost impossible. By early 1943, Allied planners had settled on Sicily as their next target. The problem was that German planners had reached much the same conclusion. Sicily sat between North Africa and mainland Italy. Any map of the Mediterranean pointed to the island. If the Allies could see its importance, so could Germany. British intelligence therefore faced a difficult task. Before a single soldier landed on Sicily's beaches, they somehow had to convince the Germans that the invasion would happen somewhere else. One of the officers working on the problem was Flight Lieutenant Charles Chumley. His proposal eventually found its way to Ewan Montague of Naval Intelligence. The basic objective was straightforward: place false information in German hands and make it appear genuine. Actually doing that was another matter. German intelligence was not going to accept a set of military documents simply because they happened to appear. The documents needed a believable route into enemy hands. They needed a courier. Someone whose presence would explain why confidential papers had been carrying information about future Allied operations. As Montague and his colleagues worked through the problem, the solution became increasingly unusual. The courier would never be questioned, never be interrogated, never be asked to explain himself, because the courier would already be dead. That decision created a new challenge. Finding a suitable body was only the beginning. The real difficulty was creating a person who had never existed. The Germans would investigate everything they could find about him: his profession, his relationships, his habits, his finances. If any detail felt artificial, the entire operation could collapse. So British intelligence began constructing a life from scratch. The man was given a name: Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. From there, the details accumulated: identity papers, personal letters, receipts, bank correspondence. None of these items were particularly important on their own. Together, however, they created something far more convincing than forged documents. They created the appearance of a real human being. By the spring of 1943, Major William Martin existed on paper in almost every way that mattered. There was only one thing left to do: get him to Spain. Finding a body turned out to be easier than creating a believable life around it. British intelligence eventually obtained the body of a man who had died in London only weeks earlier. His name was Blindware Michael. The operation now entered a stage few outside a small circle of intelligence officers would ever know about. Before the body could be used, an entirely new identity had to be built around it. The man would become Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines. The choice was deliberate. The rank was high enough to explain why he might be carrying sensitive documents, but not so high that other officers would be expected to know him personally. Everything about him had to appear ordinary. Because ordinary people are rarely questioned. For weeks, British intelligence worked on details that most people would never notice. An identity card was prepared. Official passes were issued. Photographs were taken. Documents were aged by hand until they looked as though they had spent months in a wallet. A uniform was worn repeatedly so it no longer appeared fresh from storage. Even the smallest inconsistencies were hunted down. Bank correspondence. The sort of paperwork people carry without thinking about it. A letter from his father. Ticket stubs from evenings spent in London. Club bills, keys, cigarettes, matches, nothing remarkable. That was precisely the point. Months later, if someone emptied his pockets onto a table, they wouldn't see an intelligence operation. By April 1943, William Martin existed everywhere except in reality. All that remained was preparing the body itself. In the early hours of April 17, the final transformation began. The corpse was dressed in a Royal Marines uniform. Its pockets were filled with the life British intelligence had spent weeks constructing. The confidential documents were secured inside a briefcase. Then the body was sealed inside a metal container packed with dry ice. As the ice slowly evaporated, carbon dioxide filled the chamber, preserving the body during its journey. Before dawn, the container was loaded into a van. Montague and Chumley accompanied it through the darkness as it was driven north across Britain. Its destination was Greenock, on the west coast of Scotland. Waiting there was a submarine, HMS Seraph. Even most of the crew had no idea what they were transporting. They were told the canister contained a classified meteorological device. The truth remained known to only a handful of people. On April 19, Seraph slipped out to sea. Over the following days it crossed toward Spain. Twice during the voyage, enemy aircraft attacked in the vicinity. The submarine continued on. Inside, Major William Martin waited in silence. 9 days later, before dawn on April 30, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast near Huelva. The crew remained below deck. Only a small group of officers stayed above. The container was opened. For the first time, Major William Martin emerged into the open air. Then the body was lowered into the sea. Slowly, the current began carrying Major Martin toward the Spanish shore. At that moment, Operation Mincemeat passed beyond British control. Everything now depended on whether somebody would find him. Today, visitors to a quiet cemetery in Huelva can find the grave of Blindwar Michael. For years, many knew him only as Major William Martin. History remembers the operation. But behind one of the greatest military deceptions ever attempted, there was, in the end, just one ordinary man whose final journey changed the course of a war.